Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really getting into something interesting. It's a piece by Jaime Hoerricks called Episode 232 Lutnick.pdf.
Yeah, it's got some heavy hitters in there.
Yeah.
We're talking Yuval Noah Harari's, warnings, I guess, and then these proposals from Howard Lutnick, the U.S. Commerce Secretary.
Exactly. And what we want to do is, unpack what this might actually mean for work, for society, for us, really.
And right off the bat, Hoerricks brings up this fascinating tension, this idea that maybe we've been looking in the wrong direction.
How so?
Well, the classic fear was always the state, wasn't it? Orwell's Big Brother, government control.
Right.
But the argument here is maybe while we were watching the government, the real power shift was happening somewhere else. More towards the market, towards corporate influence.
Hoerricks calls that the head fake. Yeah, like a magician's trick. We're watching the government's hand.
While the other hand, the market hand, is fundamentally reshaping things. Think algorithms deciding what you see rather than state censors.
Okay, so that sets the scene. And the two key figures here are Harari and Lutnick. Very different angles, but maybe pointing towards something similar.
That seems to be the connection Hoerricks is making. You've got Harari talking about this potential useless class.
Let's start there. What was Harari actually warning about? This was back, late 2010s, early 2020s?
Yeah, around then. His big concern was AI and biotech getting so advanced that, a huge chunk of the population might become economically redundant.
Meaning, no jobs for them.
Essentially, yeah. Machines could do most things cheaper, better. He even floated this idea, the rich upgrading themselves biologically while everyone else is maybe pacified. Drugs, video games, screens.
Wow. And the reaction, especially from, say, the right-wing media, was pretty intense, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. They painted him as this, Bond villain figure, a globalist technocrat plotting to enslave everyone. The WF connection, the academic background, it all fed into this narrative.
The narrative being, this is a socialist plot.
Exactly. That Harari wanted this future, this controlled society. But Hoerricks makes a really crucial counterpoint here.
Which is?
Harari wasn't describing a socialist utopia or dystopia, depending on your view. He was arguably describing the logical endgame of capitalism when labor becomes optional for profit.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
Think about Marx's idea of the reserve army of labor, the unemployed people who keep wages in check.
Mm-hmm.
Harari's useless class is like that, but maybe permanent. Not just a temporary pool, but a whole segment of society that the economic engine simply doesn't need anymore.
That's a profound level of alienation, isn't it? Not just from what you produce, but from the act of working itself, from purpose, from participation.
Totally. And Hoerricks frames it starkly. The useless class is basically what capital calls people it no longer requires, but hasn't figured out how to discard yet.
Okay. So while Harari is issuing these warnings, you have this conservative reaction.
Right, the villainization.
Yeah.
But Hoerricks suggests there's a kind of, sleight of hand going on.
The head fake again.
Sort of. While these voices were loudly condemning government overreach and Harari's supposed plans, Hoerricks argues they were often simultaneously pushing for things like deregulation, privatization, basically policies that might actually create a world closer to what Harari warned about, but run by algorithms and market forces, not the state. Think Milton Friedman's ideas, but maybe on steroids.
So it's like saying, watch out for the government while building a system where corporate power becomes almost absolute.
That's the argument. It's this ideological flip. You warn against a dystopia framed as socialism while potentially building a similar structure, just stripped of any social safety nets.
Hoerricks brings in Gramsci here, right? The idea of hegemony.
Yeah, how dominant ideas become common sense. So corporate control gets framed as freedom or choice, while public investment, like in education or healthcare, gets labeled tyranny.
It makes me think of that Uzek point Hoerricks mentions.
Oh, the one about how those warning loudest about dystopia are sometimes the ones preparing to implement it?
Yeah, but they frame it as necessary or even desirable, like it's just the way things have to be.
Exactly. Freedom becomes the slogan for a system that might actually be reducing real freedom.
Which leads us straight into education. Hoerricks argues this whole process, the creation of this potential useless class, it starts way earlier in school.
Yeah, this is really provocative part of the analysis.
Yeah.
The argument is that the very purpose of education is shifting.
How so?
Take reading. Is it about deep immersion, critical thinking, discovery? Or is it increasingly about compliance? About extracting information quickly for a test, getting the main idea, and moving on?
Like skimming versus really engaging.
Kind of. Valuing shallow, quick processing over that deeper, more recursive thinking needed for complex problems. Hoerricks mentions a 2023 essay, Recreational Reading, touching on this.
And this focus, this particular way of teaching, it might not work for everyone, right?
That's a key point. Hoerricks highlights neurodivergent learners, specifically mentioning Gestalt language processors. These are people who might learn language in chunks, in patterns, not necessarily word-by-word phonics.
Which is the dominant method, phonics.
Right, and if the system is heavily biased towards that one method, what happens to the kids who learn differently? Hoerricks suggests it could be a huge number, maybe even like 40% of the population, who aren't being served well. They're being taught compliance over comprehension, almost.
Wow. And Hoerricks connects this to Althusser.
Yeah, Althusser's concept of the ideological state apparatus, how institutions like schools pass down the ruling ideology. But Hoerricks gives it a twist, the ideological market apparatus.
Meaning
It's not just the state, but increasingly corporate interests and market logic shaping education. The goal becomes producing docile workers, consumers, people who fit the system rather than questioning it.
So the useless class isn't just people losing jobs later. It's potentially being cultivated from the start by an education system that discourages deep curiosity.
That's the unsettling implication, yeah. Stifling the very critical thinking that might challenge the direction things are heading.
Okay, so we have this backdrop. Potential mass economic irrelevance, an education system perhaps not fostering critical thought, and then boom, May 2025, Howard Lutnick.
Yeah, the Secretary of Commerce. And he announces this new model, generational factory work.
This wasn't just a throwaway line, according to Hoerricks.
No, it's presented as a serious blueprint, a vision that seems to dovetail chillingly with that useless class idea.
Inherited jobs. Your kids will work here. Their kids will work here.
Exactly. It's a far cry from the old idea of factory work as a ladder up, isn't it? Especially now.
Because factories today are different. Automation, surveillance.
Totally. The jobs are often more about maintenance, less about skilled production, often precarious, heavily monitored. Lutnick mentioned a figure like $90,000 a year.
Yeah, I saw that. Sounds good on the surface.
But, as Hoerricks points out, you have to see it in context. Declining public services, the crazy cost of college. Is $90 Ks in a potentially dead-end, inherited factory job really opportunity? Or is it maybe a cage? A comfortable one, perhaps, but still a limit on possibility.
It sounds like Marx's deskilling or Engels watching the working class reproduce itself generation after generation.
It really resonates with those older critiques, doesn't it? Hoerricks argues this isn't some bold new idea. It's kind of a retread of that old cycle, just maybe rebranded.
And Lutnick himself, former Democrat, now aligned with Trump.
Yeah, Hoerricks sees that shift as significant, suggesting that when it comes to the core interests of capital, the traditional party divides might be less important than we think.
So Lutnick's vision is presented as this enclosure of possibility, the factory as the main inheritance.
That's the interpretation, a future where mobility is curtailed, not expanded.
Okay, so we've had this debate for ages, right? Orwell versus Huxley, Big Brother or feel-good control, Hoerricks says. It's not either.
Yeah, basically that the whole debate was maybe another distraction. The reality being cooked up now seems to borrow from both.
How so? Give me the Huxley bits.
Well, the endless screens, right?
Yeah.
Social media engineered for dopamine hits, streaming services, maybe pharmaceuticals becoming more commonplace for mood management. The sedation aspect.
Okay. And the Orwell.
That's the surveillance architecture. Biometric data, facial recognition, predictive policing, algorithms tracking everything, your phone listening. Plus, the economic precarity itself acts as a control mechanism.
And crucially, it's not just one central government doing it all.
No, it's this decentralized web, private companies mostly,
Yeah.
offering convenience, connection, while extracting data and arguably autonomy.
So we've got the branded boots, maybe subsidized soma in the form of cheap entertainment, and the telescreen is in our pocket, willingly carried.
It ties into what Mark Fisher called capitalist realism, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The feeling that this is the only way things can be. The dystopia gets normalized.
Yeah, and it's sold as progress or freedom. Lutnick's factory work is patriotic. Harari's vision of pacification could be framed as care or leisure.
Choice becomes the ultimate propaganda, right? When the actual alternatives have been quietly removed or made unthinkable. Harari's point is pretty stark. The dystopia isn't coming, it's arriving in increments through software updates.
Okay, so stepping back, what's the big takeaway here? Are Harari and Lutnick the villains?
Hoerricks argues, not really. They aren't the architects, they're more like mouthpieces. articulating different facets of where the system seems to be heading anyway.
A system where labor just becomes a problem for capital, a cost to be managed or eliminated.
That's the core idea, tracing back to Marx. Harari describes the potential outcome with a kind of scholarly detachment, maybe inevitability. Lutnick frames a specific managed version of it as an opportunity. Different tones, same underlying logic.
The gospel of late capitalism, as Hoerricks puts it.
Pretty much.
And, like always, the first people to be labeled unviable or surplus.
Are those already on the margins?
Yeah.
The chronically ill, people with disabilities, the undocumented neurodivergent folks. Hoerricks even brings up that RFK Jr. proposal from 2024 about tracking autistic individuals as a worrying sign.
Why those groups specifically?
The argument is they are, in a way, surplus by design. The current system focused on conformity, productivity metrics, exploitation. It wasn't built for them. Their ways of being don't always fit neatly.
But that incompatibility,
Yeah.
maybe that's also a strength.
Exactly. That's the flicker of hope Hoerricks ends on. If these systems are designed, they can be redesigned. The people deemed surplus might actually hold the keys to imagining different ways of organizing society precisely because they don't fit the current mold.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, we started with this head fake idea of market power creeping up while we watched the state. We saw Harari's Eastless class warning and Lutnick's alternative vision of inherited work.
Yeah, and the role of education in potentially shaping minds for compliance, not critique, and how it all seems to be merging into this blend of Huxley's sedation and Orwell's surveillance. Totalized capital, as Hoerricks calls it.
It definitely leaves you thinking.
It does. And maybe that's the final thought for everyone listening. Just take a moment. Consider how these big ideas about work, education, technology, freedom, how might they already be subtly shaping your assumptions, your view of the future?
What little head fakes might be operating in your own life?
Yeah.
Maybe things you haven't questioned.
Yeah, it's complex stuff, obviously. No easy answers. But definitely worth digging into further, looking at different perspectives and just keeping our eyes open.